The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the crumbling stone walls of the old asylum. Once a place of supposed healing, it had long since been abandoned, its windows shattered, and its doors rotting from neglect. The rusted gates, barely hanging on their hinges, creaked eerily as a gust of wind swept through, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. Inside, the silence was deafening. The air felt thick, heavy, as though it carried the weight of all the suffering that had once taken place there. The floors were warped and cracked, the walls stained with years of neglect, and yet there was a strange, almost palpable sense of life, something lurking just beyond the edges of perception. A group of 5 paranormal investigators stood just outside the asylum, their faces illuminated by the cold, flickering light of their flashlights. Each one was bundled in thick jackets, trying to ward off the chill of the night, but none of them could shake the uneasy feeling that seemed to hang in the air. "Are we sure about this?" Emma asked, her voice shaking slightly as she adjusted the straps on her camera. She was the youngest of the group, barely 23, but already one of the most experienced when it came to documenting the paranormal. Still, the sight of the abandoned asylum, its looming structure stretching far above her head, made her feel small. "We're here for a reason," Alex replied, his voice confident but not without a hint of tension. He was the team leader, the one who had organized this investigation. He had been in the business for years, and he knew the risks, but even he couldn't deny the nervous flutter in his chest. "We've dealt with worse." Jason, the tech expert of the group, adjusted the camera mounted on his equipment trolley. His glasses glinted in the light, his eyes scanning the structure. "I've been studying the history of this place for months," he said, his voice steady, almost too calm. "This place has a reputation. The stories, they're not just rumors. Something happened here, something that's still lingering, and we're going to find out what." Sarah, the skeptic of the group, added, her arms crossed as she looked at the asylum with an air of disbelief. Sarah didn't buy into all the ghost stories and supernatural myths. She was the voice of reason, the one who needed scientific evidence before she'd believe anything. "I'm not convinced there's anything here but old dust and bad memories." David, the 5th member of the team, was quiet, standing at the back of the group. He was a seasoned investigator, having seen his fair share of strange occurrences. But even he couldn't suppress the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. He had heard the rumors about this place, how it had been abandoned after a string of mysterious deaths, how some patients had gone missing, their bodies never found. It was said that their spirits had never left, that they still roamed the halls, waiting for new victims. "Well, there's only one way to find out," Alex said, his tone resolute. He gestured toward the asylum's iron gates, which were slightly ajar. "Let's get inside." The group moved cautiously toward the entrance, the gravel crunching under their boots. The gates groaned as they pushed them open, the sound echoing through the night like a warning. As they stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop, a cold draft sweeping through the courtyard. Emma shivered, clutching her camera tighter as they made their way to the front doors of the asylum. The building loomed over them like a giant, its dark windows staring down, empty and unblinking. The heavy wooden doors, cracked and weathered, stood slightly ajar, as though inviting them in. Jason reached into his bag, pulling out a small device that beeped faintly in his hand. "We're getting some unusual readings already," he said, his voice low. "This place is definitely active." Sarah rolled her eyes. "You say that about every old building we visit," she teased, but her voice lacked conviction. David remained silent, his eyes scanning the building's exterior. There was something unsettling about it, something that made his stomach twist. The longer they stood there, the more he felt the weight of the place pressing down on him. He shook his head, trying to push the feeling away. It was just an old asylum, after all. Alex took a deep breath, then pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the hallway beyond. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The walls, once white, were now stained with years of neglect. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floors, remnants of a time long past. The team moved cautiously into the building, their footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floorboards. As they made their way through the dimly lit hallway, their flashlights cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, flickering with each step. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of their breathing and the occasional creak of the building settling. "Let's start in the main hall," Alex said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll set up the cameras and equipment and get a feel for the place." The group nodded and followed him into the large, open room. The air here was even colder, and the atmosphere felt oppressive. The high ceiling, once grand, now seemed to cave in with age, the dark wood beams overhead groaning under the weight of time. Broken windows lined the far wall, the shattered glass still glistening like jagged teeth in the pale light. Jason quickly began setting up the equipment, placing cameras in the corners of the room, while Emma positioned herself to capture every angle. Sarah stood near the back, arms crossed, still skeptical but starting to feel the unease settling in her chest. David, however, stood motionless in the center of the room, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his pulse quickened. It wasn't just the cold or the darkness. There was something else in the room with him. He could feel it, a presence, something watching, waiting. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper within the asylum. The group froze, their eyes snapping toward the source of the noise. It had come from the lower floors. Did anyone else hear that? Emma whispered, her camera clutched tightly in her hands. Alex nodded, his face pale. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice low. "Let's check it out." They moved cautiously, their flashlights casting erratic beams of light as they made their way down a narrow corridor. The sound of their footsteps seemed to echo impossibly loud, mingling with the creaking of the old building. As they rounded the corner, they came to a large metal door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and a thick, musty smell wafted out from the crack. Alex motioned for everyone to stop. "Something's in there." Without another word, he pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the broken windows. The floor was covered in old papers and broken furniture, but that wasn't what caught their attention. On the far wall, barely visible in the dim light, was a symbol, a strange, crude drawing, almost like a ritualistic mark. And beneath it, the faintest outline of something moving, something watching them. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The door slammed shut with a sound that echoed in their bones. A chill ran through the group as the air seemed to freeze in an instant. Emma jumped, her camera falling from her hands and crashing onto the floor. The flashlight she'd been holding flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. "What the hell?" Sarah muttered, her voice trembling as she turned around, only to find the door was now locked, its rusted bolt clicking into place as if by some unseen force. Alex, who had been closest to the door, tried to yank it open, but it wouldn't budge. His muscles strained as he pulled with all his strength, but it was useless. The door seemed to have grown heavier, the rusted metal groaning in protest against any effort to open it. "Great, just great," Jason said, his voice low but filled with frustration. "We're trapped." David stood in the back, his eyes wide as he scanned the room, trying to make sense of the situation. The strange symbol on the wall, the faint outline of something moving. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone. that something was watching them, something ancient and malevolent. "I don't like this," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible as she reached for her fallen camera, her hands shaking. She quickly checked the screen, hoping the footage had captured what they had seen, but the screen was static, showing nothing but white noise. "There has to be another way out," Alex said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. He stepped away from the door and turned toward the rest of the room. "Let's search for another exit, fast." The room they had entered was larger than it had appeared at first. It was a long, narrow space with old medical equipment strewn about. Rusted gurneys, overturned wheelchairs, broken mirrors, and stained bandages. The stench of decay was thick, suffocating in the stale air. The group began to move through the room, their flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. The eerie silence of the place was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional creak of the building settling. But beneath it all, there was something else. Something they couldn't quite place. A faint whispering, soft and unintelligible, almost like a distant conversation. "Did you hear that?" Jason asked, his voice tight with fear. "Yeah, it's coming from over there," Sarah replied, her eyes scanning the far corner of the room where the shadows seemed to gather in unnaturally sharp angles. David, still unable to shake the feeling of being watched, stepped toward the corner. As he moved, the whispering grew louder, the words becoming clearer, but still too distant to make sense of. "They're not real. They can't be," Emma whispered to herself, her eyes darting around the room in panic. But as soon as she spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. A cold wind blew from nowhere, sending a shiver down their spines. The shadows in the corner of the room flickered, as though something was moving within them, shifting with a life of its own. "I don't care what anyone says," Sarah said, her voice now shaky, her arms wrapping around herself for warmth. "I don't think this place is just haunted. There's something here, something worse." David didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the corner where the shadows seemed to bend unnaturally, as though they were alive. He reached out, hesitating for only a moment before touching the wall. As soon as his fingers brushed against the cold surface, a sharp gasp escaped his lips, and the whispering grew louder, now forming words in the cold air. "Help us. Free us." David froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was as though the walls themselves were speaking to him, their voices thick with desperation. "Help us, or we will make you stay." The words were clear now, each one sending a chill through his body. Before he could pull his hand away, the air around him seemed to grow thick, like something was pressing against him, holding him in place. "David!" Emma screamed from across the room, her voice filled with terror. David tried to pull back, but his body refused to move. It was as if invisible hands were gripping him, holding him in place, the cold seeping into his bones. "David!" Alex shouted again, rushing toward him. With a burst of strength, David finally managed to pull his hand away from the wall. But as soon as he did, the whispering stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The temperature in the room shot back up, the oppressive cold lifting as quickly as it had come. He stumbled back, breathless, his eyes wide with shock. Did you hear that?" Sarah's face had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that? What the hell is going on here?" Before anyone could respond, the door at the far end of the room creaked open. The group froze, their eyes snapping toward the entrance. The door had been locked just moments ago, and now it was open, swinging slowly on its hinges. The darkness beyond it seemed to pulse, as though something was waiting for them in the shadows. "Stay close," Alex ordered, his voice calm but commanding. "We're getting out of here." The group, shaken but determined, moved toward the door, their flashlights casting shaky beams into the unknown. As they crossed the threshold, a sudden gust of wind blew past them, and the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. They found themselves in a narrow hallway, the walls covered in peeling paint and mold. The air was thick with the stench of dampness, and the faint sounds of their breathing seemed amplified in the silence. "Where are we?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex glanced around, his face grim. "I don't know, but we're not alone." They had just taken a few steps down the hallway when they heard it, the sound of footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Turning quickly, they saw nothing but darkness. The hallway stretched out before them, empty, yet the footsteps continued, echoing through the long, abandoned corridor. "Who's there?" Jason called, his voice shaky, but no answer came. Then, from the far end of the hall, they saw it. A figure, tall, thin, its features obscured by the shadows, but its presence unmistakable. It was watching them. The figure at the far end of the hallway didn't move. It just stood there, cloaked in the darkness, watching them. Its silhouette was unnaturally tall and thin, as though it had been stretched by some unnatural force. The way it stood, rigid and unmoving, made David's skin crawl. Felt wrong. It wasn't just another shadow. It was something else. "Who is that?" Sarah's voice trembled as she stepped back, her flashlight shaking in her hands. David tried to peer into the shadows, but the figure remained out of reach of the light. The more he tried to focus on it, the more distorted it seemed. It was as if the darkness itself was playing tricks on his eyes. "I don't know," Alex replied, his voice low, a mixture of curiosity and fear lacing his words. "But we need to keep moving." The group, despite their unease, began to inch forward, moving slowly down the hallway, their flashlights casting long shadows against the peeling walls. The footsteps behind them had stopped, but the air around them seemed charged, as though something unseen was closing in. David's heart thudded in his chest as the figure didn't move. It felt as though it was waiting for them to make the first move, like some kind of test. The atmosphere around them grew heavier, thicker with every step they took. But no one dared to look back. "I think we should turn back," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper. "This doesn't feel right." "Agreed," Jason said, his eyes scanning the darkness, his grip tightening around his flashlight. "This place is messed up." But before anyone could voice their concerns, a sudden noise echoed down the hallway, a loud, low moan that seemed to come from the walls themselves, reverberating through their bones. The air grew colder, and with it, a faint stench of rot filled their nostrils. "Did you hear that?" Sarah gasped, her face pale. Alex nodded grimly, his eyes darting around, looking for the source of the sound. "We're not alone here. Whatever that thing was at the end of the hall, it wasn't human." Before anyone could respond, the moan came again, louder this time. And then came the sound of something dragging across the floor. Slow, deliberate, and rhythmic, like the scraping of claws on stone. "Move!" David shouted, his voice sharp as he grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her forward. The others followed quickly, adrenaline surging through their veins as they quickened their pace. They reached a set of old, decaying double doors. The rusted handles were barely hanging on, but it was their only chance for escape. David grabbed the door and pulled with all his strength. To his relief, the door creaked open, revealing a large, dimly lit room beyond. It smelled like damp wood and decay, and the flickering light of their flashlights cast strange, elongated shadows on the walls. The moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them, making them all jump. The sound of dragging claws was now close, much too close, and it was coming from behind them. "Are we locked in?" Jason asked, panic creeping into his voice. David tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The cold metal handle didn't give way, no matter how hard he pulled. Locked, Alex confirmed, his voice tense. We're trapped. The scraping noise was now unmistakable. It was getting closer. David could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the temperature in the room dropped drastically. His breath came out in short, visible bursts as the freezing air surrounded them. I don't think we're alone in here, Sarah whispered. David's flashlight flickered as he scanned the room. It was larger than he had expected, with towering shelves full of broken medical equipment and discarded paperwork scattered across the floor. In the corner, something caught his eye. A large, rusted cage with bars that had long since fallen apart. Inside, the remnants of old mattresses and blankets were piled up in disarray, adding to the overall sense of abandonment. But it wasn't the room that made his heart race. It was what was standing in the middle of it. Figure, person, or at least it looked like one. A woman, hunched over in the center of the room, her head bent low as though she was waiting for something. Her hair, long and matted, hung down in tangled strands. She wore a tattered hospital gown, and her skin was a sickly shade of gray, as though she hadn't seen sunlight in years. She made no sound, no movement. She simply stood there, unmoving, as though she was waiting for them to notice her. David froze, his breath caught in his throat. "Is that?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the woman's head snapped up. Her eyes were wide, empty, black pits that seemed to go on forever, as though they had no soul behind them. Her mouth stretched open unnaturally wide, revealing a row of sharp, broken teeth. The sound of her breath, harsh and uneven, filled the room as she slowly began to rise to her feet, her movements jerky and unnatural. Then, without warning, she lunged. "Run!" Alex screamed, pushing Sarah out of the way as the woman charged at them. David barely had time to react as the woman's claws slashed the air, missing him by inches. The force of her movement sent a wave of cold through the room, and the air thickened with the stench of rot. "Get to the door!" Jason shouted, his voice filled with panic as he scrambled to open the door behind them. But the handle wouldn't turn. The woman was gaining on them, her movements faster now, more fluid, as though the air itself had given her strength. David could hear her ragged breathing, her claws scraping the floor as she closed the distance between them. "Come on! Come on!" Jason shouted again, yanking at the door. The woman reached for David's arm, her fingers like icy tendrils wrapping around him. He struggled to pull away, but her grip tightened, sending a shock of cold through his body. In a desperate bid to free himself, David swung his flashlight at her, hitting her in the face with enough force to make her stumble back. For a moment, the woman hesitated, allowing David to break free. The door finally creaked open, and the group rushed out into the hallway, the woman's howls echoing in their ears. But they weren't safe yet. The shadows around them seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if the very walls of the asylum were closing in on them. Something was following them, and it wasn't just the woman. It was something worse. David's heart pounded in his chest as he ran, the sound of his own breath filling his ears, heavy and erratic. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the presence of something following them. Something dark, relentless, and hungry. The asylum's labyrinth of corridors twisted and turned in ways that made it feel like the building was alive, shifting to trap them inside. The walls seemed to close in, their peeling paint and cracked tiles adding to the suffocating sense of dread that clung to the air. "Keep moving!" Jason yelled, his voice a sharp command, snapping David out of his panic-stricken thoughts. They rounded a corner, barely avoiding the rusted, jagged edges of old medical equipment that littered the floor. The group didn't stop to check the room they had entered. They were running purely on instinct now, trying to find an exit, any way out of this nightmare. The darkened hallways stretched endlessly, each door they passed showing nothing but shadowed emptiness. There was no sign of the woman, or whatever it had been, but David could feel her presence lingering. The air itself felt wrong, thick with an unnatural cold that seemed to seep into his bones. "Where do we go now?" Sarah gasped, her breath shallow as she glanced around, searching for an escape. "This place is a maze." David's eyes scanned the hallway, but there was nothing but more darkness ahead. The flashlight in his hand flickered again, and he instinctively banged it against his palm, trying to bring it back to life. The light buzzed back on, casting an eerie glow on the surroundings, but it didn't help the feeling of unease gnawing at his insides. Suddenly, Alex stopped in his tracks. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Do you hear that?" he asked, voice low, as if speaking too loudly would draw attention to them. The others stopped as well, holding their breath. It was faint at first, a soft scratching sound, like nails on concrete, and then it grew louder, coming from the walls around them, as though something or someone was crawling inside them. David felt a chill that ran down his spine. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his hand gripping his flashlight so tightly his knuckles turned white. The scratching grew more frantic, as if whatever was behind the walls was trying to break through. David's skin crawled, his senses overwhelmed by the noise. It was as though the walls themselves were alive, groaning and shifting in response to whatever was trapped inside. And then, without warning, the wall closest to them erupted. A jagged crack split the plaster, and out of the darkness, a hand shot through, its fingers long, twisted, and sharp. The fingers scraped against the edges of the hole, and with a terrifying screech, the rest of the arm followed. It was thin, almost skeletal, the skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too long for any human. "Oh God," Emma whispered, stepping backward, her eyes wide with horror. David's heart stopped as the hand withdrew, and in its place, the faint outline of a face began to appear. Eyes black and hollow, staring directly at them from within the hole in the wall. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just stared. A shiver ran down David's spine as the figure seemed to grow, expanding beyond the confines of the wall. The face, a twisted mockery of a human's, began to take form. A grotesque, emaciated figure with skin stretched so tightly over its skull that it looked almost like a mask. Its mouth was wide, twisted into a cruel smile, revealing jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. The creature's eyes locked onto David, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. His body froze, his breath catching in his throat as the creature's gaze bore into him. Suddenly, the thing lunged forward, its arm reaching out from the hole in the wall within human speed. It was faster than any human could be, and before David could react, it grabbed his leg, its nails digging into his flesh. "Help!" David screamed, the words escaping his lips before he could stop them. He kicked and thrashed, trying to break free, but the thing's grip was unyielding, pulling him closer to the gaping hole in the wall. "David!" Sarah screamed, rushing forward, but she was stopped by a low growl that echoed through the hallway. It was the woman again, the one they had seen before. Her twisted form stepped into the flickering light, blocking their way. "Get away from him!" Alex yelled, but it was useless. The woman advanced, her head cocked at an unnatural angle, her eyes black and lifeless as they followed David's every move. David's heart raced as he tried to free himself from the creature's grasp, but it was too strong. He could feel his body being pulled inch by inch toward the hole, the sharp claws scraping against his skin as they dragged him closer to the waiting darkness beyond. He could hear the woman's breath, heavy and ragged, growing closer as she crept toward him. "Not again," David gasped, panic rising in his chest as the woman reached for him, her fingers cold and clammy. The air around him thickened, pressing against him like a vice, and every movement seemed to slow as the darkness pressed in. And then, as though by some unseen force, the creature's grip loosened. It released him, and David was thrown back into the others, landing hard against the floor. "Get up!" Alex shouted, pulling David to his feet as the woman let out a high-pitched screech, her form jerking violently. She was no longer just watching them. She was coming for them. "Run!" David shouted, adrenaline pumping through his veins as he staggered to his feet. The group turned and ran, not knowing where they were going, only knowing that they had to get away. The walls seemed to close in on them, the very asylum itself fighting against them. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the sounds of the woman's frantic steps echoed behind them, getting louder and louder with every passing second. David's breath came in short gasps as they sprinted through the hallways, their flashlights flickering, barely illuminating the path ahead. The scratching sounds came again, louder this time, as if 100 hands were clawing their way through the walls, trying to reach them. They had no time to stop. They had no time to think. All they could do was run. The group didn't stop running. They couldn't. Every step they took, every corridor they turned, felt like they were only running deeper into the heart of the asylum's malevolent grasp. The echo of their hurried footsteps bounced off the walls, amplified in the claustrophobic space. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, reaching out to pull them back into the suffocating darkness they had just escaped. David's breath was ragged, each inhale burning his lungs. He glanced over at his team, each of them pale and wide-eyed, the terror in their faces unmistakable. But it was Alex who stood out. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and growing panic, his eyes flicking around as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. "We need to find another exit," Sarah said, her voice strained, but it didn't hold the strength it once did. She was slowing down, her legs heavy with exhaustion, her steps faltering as the adrenaline wore off. "We'll find one," David replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. The asylum was too vast, its corridors endless. They had no way of knowing if they were even close to the entrance, or if they were spiraling deeper into the bowels of this hellish place. A sudden crash echoed from behind them, followed by a shrill, otherworldly scream. They froze. The scream was loud, so loud that it reverberated through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the building. It was the woman again, but this time her cry was different. It was filled with rage and hunger, an unholy sound that made their blood run cold. Without thinking, they bolted forward, their feet pounding the floor as they tried to outrun the sound, as though escaping it might somehow make them safer. But the asylum had no mercy. "Look," Emma cried, pointing ahead. "There's a door." In the distance, a door stood ajar, its edges framed in a faint light. It was an exit, they hoped. Desperate for any chance to escape, they rushed toward it, not caring about the noise or the dangers lurking behind them. David reached the door first, his hands trembling as he gripped the handle. He turned it. Nothing. It didn't budge. The door was locked. "No, no, no," he hissed, slamming his shoulder against it in frustration. "It has to open. Come on." Behind them, the screaming intensified. The woman, whatever she was getting closer. David could feel her presence, a pressure in the air that made his skin crawl. The scratching from the walls had stopped, but something worse had replaced it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. heavy and dragging. "Help me with this," David shouted, but his voice sounded distant even to his own ears. The others rushed to him, and together, they shoved against the door with all their might. The cold steel groaned in protest, but it remained stubbornly shut. The footsteps grew louder. "We're not going to make it," Alex cried out, his voice tight with fear. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes wild, as if searching for a way out of this nightmare. "We need to." He was cut off by a sickening thud, followed by a chilling sound, the distinct, slithering scrape of something moving toward them. Something inhuman. David turned, his heart leaping into his throat as he saw the shadowy figure at the far end of the hallway. The woman. No, she wasn't alone. Behind her, something much worse had appeared. It was tall, its body gaunt and twisted, its skin stretched tight over its bones, giving it the appearance of a marionette left to decay. The creature's face was hollow, a grotesque parody of humanity, with eyes black as coal and a mouth that gaped unnaturally wide. Its arms were too long, its hands ending in claws that scraped along the floor with each slow step. The Wendigo. The hunger it exuded was palpable, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just after them, it was after their very souls. "Move!" Jason shouted, panic seizing him as the Wendigo crept closer. He turned back to the door and slammed his fist against the windowpane. The glass shattered with a deafening crack. "We're getting out through here." Without a moment's hesitation, the group squeezed through the broken window, their bodies scraping against the shards as they jumped into the small alley outside. The cold air hit them like a slap to the face, and for a brief moment, they thought they had escaped. But the Wendigo wasn't done with them. The group stumbled into the alley, breathless, disoriented. They looked around, but there was no clear path forward, only more darkness and decay. The alley seemed to stretch on endlessly, disappearing into the murk of the asylum's foundation. But before they could even think about running, they heard it. A low growl, guttural and menacing, echoed from within the building. It wasn't over. The Wendigo wasn't just a creature of hunger. It was a creature of vengeance, born from the souls of the lost, the souls of those who had once roamed these very halls. And now they were its prey. "Where do we go?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, her face ashen with fear. David scanned their surroundings, desperation clawing at him. There was no escape. The asylum was everywhere. It had been built to trap them. It was alive, and it was hungry. "We need to find the others," David said, though even he wasn't sure what he meant by that. Who were the others? The spirits that had never left? Were they trying to warn them? Or were they part of the madness that now surrounded them? "I don't think we're alone out here," Emma said, her voice barely audible. Her eyes were wide with terror, darting nervously to the shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. Before David could respond, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from behind them. Slowly they turned. A figure stepped into the alley, silhouetted by the dim light from the broken windows. It was the woman, but she wasn't just the woman anymore. Her face was twisted beyond recognition. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide in a grotesque grin that made David's stomach churn. Her eyes were black pits, hollow and empty, and her hands were no longer human. They were long, gnarled claws, fingers twitching as if they were eager to strike. She took a step toward them, her feet dragging across the ground, her movements jerky and unnatural, her head cocked to one side, as if studying them like prey. David felt his heart race, fear turning his blood cold. They were surrounded, and the Wendigo was getting closer. The cold wind howled through the narrow alley as the woman, no, the thing that had once been a woman, took another agonizing step toward them. The twisted, horrific smile on her face stretched wider with each movement, her hollow eyes glinting with malice. Her fingers scraped against the brick walls, leaving deep, claw-like gouges in the stone as she approached. David's heart raced, his breath shallow and quick. He could feel the presence of the Wendigo, not far behind, its cold hunger filling the air. He could hear its every step, a haunting, dragging sound that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "We need to run," David said, his voice urgent but barely more than a whisper. Emma was trembling, her face pale with fear. She looked at David, then at the thing in front of them and back at David. "But where do we go?" "The asylum. It's everywhere." David didn't have an answer. The fear that had gripped him earlier was now beginning to morph into something else. An unsettling realization that they were trapped, that there was no escape. This place, this forsaken asylum, was no longer just a building. It had become something alive, something hungry, and they were its prey. The woman was closer now, her rasping breaths mingling with the wind. Her eyes glinted with malevolent delight, like she was savoring their fear, relishing in the power she held over them. "Move!" Jason shouted, his voice breaking through the thick fog of panic. He grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her back, urging them to run. "We can't just stand here." David, despite the bone-deep dread that threatened to paralyze him, managed to pull himself together. He nodded sharply and motioned for the others to follow him. They turned, racing down the alley, their footsteps a frantic blur in the darkness. But they didn't make it far. A screeching, unholy sound split the air, and in an instant, David felt the temperature drop sharply. It was as if the very air around them had thickened, becoming heavy and suffocating. His skin prickled with cold, his breath turning to visible steam as the world around him seemed to freeze. They had reached the end of the alley, but there was nowhere to go. The walls rose high on either side, towering above them like sentinels. The exit, their hope, was blocked by shadows, creeping and twisting into something darker, something alive. And then it emerged, the Wendigo. It was no longer a shadow lurking in the distance. It was here, standing before them in all its horrifying glory. The creature's body was unnaturally thin, its skin stretched taut over the sharp bones, like a carcass that had been left to rot. Its eyes, dark and endless, bored into them, and its mouth, far too wide for any human being, was filled with jagged teeth, dripping with hunger. Its clawed hands reached forward, dragging its long arms along the ground, leaving deep scratches on the stone. It was close, too close. David felt his heart stop as he realized there was no way to outrun it. The Wendigo was faster, stronger, and it had no mercy. It was a creature born of darkness and starvation, driven by an insatiable hunger that could never be quenched. "Go!" David shouted, pushing the others toward the narrow passage that led into the shadows. "Get out of here. I'll hold it off." But none of them moved. They were rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. "No," Jason said, his voice shaking. "We stay together. We'll fight this." David shook his head, his hands trembling. "There's no fighting this thing. You have to go. Now." The Wendigo let out a low, guttural growl, its mouth opening wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It advanced toward them, its claws scraping against the ground, the air thick with its overwhelming hunger. Suddenly, the woman appeared again, stepping into the alley like a shadow from the deepest pits of hell. Her face was now twisted beyond recognition, a grotesque mockery of humanity, and her eyes gleamed with malicious intent. David's heart pounded in his chest as he backed up, his hand gripping a rusty pipe he had found earlier. He didn't know what good it would do against the Wendigo or the woman, but it was the only thing he had. "Stay away from them," David shouted, raising the pipe. He swung it wildly, hoping to hit something, anything to slow them down. But the woman was too quick. She lunged at him, her hands reaching out with unnatural speed, grabbing hold of his wrist. The world spun as he was yanked forward, his vision blurring with the force of the pull. He could feel her cold, clammy fingers digging into his flesh, her grip tightening as if she wanted to tear him apart. "David!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the Wendigo's roar. Before David could react, the creature was upon him, its clawed hands grabbing at his legs, pulling him down. He screamed, trying to push it away, but it was too strong. The Wendigo's breath was fetid, a putrid mix of rot and decay, and its mouth was inches from his face, ready to snap shut. Then, just as he thought it was over, the woman let out a shriek, a sound that could curdle blood, and suddenly everything went black. David's body felt weightless, as though he was drifting through a thick fog. The cold air that had once been suffocating now felt distant, as if he was being pulled away from it. He could hear voices, but they were muffled, indistinct. When his eyes fluttered open, he was no longer in the alley. He was in a dark, empty room, surrounded by walls that seemed to pulse with a sickening energy. The air smelled of mildew and rot, and the floor beneath him was cold, slick with what he could only assume was blood. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as he slowly pushed himself up, his head spinning with confusion. Where was he? What had happened? He looked around, his gaze falling on the others. They were all there, lying motionless on the floor, their bodies twisted and broken in ways that no living person should be. But it was the look on their faces that made David's blood run cold. Their eyes were wide open, but there was no life in them, no soul. They were gone, and David was next. The Wendigo was back. David's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he fought to shake the lingering fog of unconsciousness. His body ached, his muscles stiff from being frozen in place. But what troubled him most was the sensation that something otherworldly, was still watching him. He could feel it, a presence that lingered in the corners of his mind, ever present and hungry. The room he was in had the same suffocating air as the asylum's corridors, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. He slowly rose to his feet, fighting against the dizziness that threatened to pull him under again. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he steadied himself against the cold, stone wall. As his vision cleared, his worst fears were confirmed. The others, the team he had come to the asylum with, were scattered across the floor, their bodies contorted unnaturally. Their faces were frozen in expressions of terror, their eyes wide open, yet empty of life. A sickening chill crawled down David's spine as he took in the sight. He tried to push the image out of his mind, but the cold reality of it settled deep in his chest. He couldn't stay here. He had to find a way out. The oppressive silence was shattered by a sudden, sharp crack, a sound like bones snapping under pressure. David spun around, his heart racing, his mind frantically searching for the source. At the far side of the room, the shadows shifted. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, hunched, its elongated limbs scraping against the walls as it moved. The Wendigo. It was here, and it was hungry. David's heart pounded in his chest. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto him, and he could feel its hunger, a gnawing emptiness that filled the room and threatened to swallow him whole. Its breath was slow and labored, and as it moved closer, its rancid stench filled David's nostrils. His throat tightened. There was no way out of this. The creature stopped a few feet away from him, its twisted mouth opening wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It spoke, Not in words, but in a guttural, bone-chilling growl that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. The air grew colder still, and David could see the tendrils of frost creeping along the walls, reaching toward him. He could feel the power of the Wendigo, the unholy force that had been awakened in this place. It had been waiting for years, perhaps centuries, feeding on the souls of those who had dared to enter. And now it was his turn. David backed up, his legs trembling with fear. There was no escape, no hope. He was trapped. But as the Wendigo took a step closer, something shifted in David's mind. A spark of defiance flickered, the instinct to survive rising above the paralyzing fear that had gripped him. He wasn't going to die here, not like this. He searched frantically around the room for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on a rusted metal pipe, discarded in the corner. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. He grabbed it, his hands shaking, and held it in front of him like a makeshift weapon. It was no match for the Wendigo, but it was the only thing that could stand between him and certain death. The Wendigo hissed, a sound that grated on David's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. It lunged forward, its clawed hands reaching for him with terrifying speed. David swung the pipe at the creature's face, his body reacting on instinct. The blow landed, but it didn't stop the Wendigo. It didn't even flinch. Instead, it let out a high-pitched, ear-splitting screech that made David's ears ring. With a roar of fury, the Wendigo grabbed him by the shoulders and slammed him against the wall. The impact stole the air from his lungs, and for a moment, everything went black. David's vision swam as he struggled to regain consciousness. He felt his body being lifted, his head spinning. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he fought against the overwhelming darkness that threatened to pull him under. "Not yet," David muttered through clenched teeth. "Not today." With a sudden burst of strength, he twisted his body, breaking free of the Wendigo's grasp. He fell to the floor, gasping for air, and scrambled to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. The Wendigo's growl was low, almost amused, as it watched him. It knew he was weak, that his chances of survival were slim. But David wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He glanced around, his eyes falling on the bodies of his team members. Their spirits were still trapped in this hellish place, their souls bound to the asylum by the Wendigo's curse. They were the ones who had opened the door, the ones who had disturbed the creature's slumber. David could feel their pain, their fear, their desperation. He couldn't let them suffer any longer. "Get out," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get out of here. This is your prison, not mine." The Wendigo's eyes narrowed, its hunger turning to rage. It was no longer just after David. It was after everything, the souls of the dead and the living alike. As David staggered backward, his mind raced. There had to be a way to stop this. He had to find a way to destroy the creature, to end the curse that had bound it to this place for so long. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing deeper, more suffocating. And then, from the darkness, a voice, soft, barely a whisper, spoke. "End it, David. You have the power. You just have to believe." David froze, the voice familiar yet foreign. It was Emma, or at least it sounded like her. He turned toward the voice, his heart pounding in his chest. There, standing at the threshold of the room, was Emma, alive. But something was wrong. Her eyes were empty, her body moving unnaturally, her movements jerky and stiff. She was no longer the person he had known. She was a vessel, a pawn of the Wendigo. David's hand tightened around the pipe as he prepared for the final confrontation. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about ending the nightmare that had begun with a single step into the asylum's cursed halls. The Wendigo's growl echoed louder, the sound deafening. as it prepared for its final attack. David had no more time to think. It was now or never. David's heart raced as Emma, no, whatever had become of Emma, advanced toward him. The voice had called out to him, but her eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, told him everything he needed to know. She was no longer herself. She was an empty shell, a vessel for the Wendigo's insidious power. "Emma," David whispered, his voice trembling, fighting back the overwhelming tide of fear. "Please, fight it. You're still in there." Her lips barely moved, but her words came out in a chilling, hollow tone. "It's too late, David. The Wendigo is inside me, inside all of us. You cannot stop it. You cannot escape it." His grip tightened on the rusted pipe, the weight of its cold steel grounding him to reality. There was no time for hesitation. He couldn't think of Emma as the person she used to be anymore. This was something far darker, something ancient, powerful, and relentless. The Wendigo's curse had infected her, and now it was closing in on him. David's mind raced, memories of the chilling night he had first entered the asylum flashing before him. The darkness, the whispers, the eerie sense of dread that had settled like a weight upon their hearts. It was all leading to this moment, the moment of reckoning, and he had to make a choice. The Wendigo, in Emma's body, took another slow, deliberate step forward. Its once human form was now a grotesque mockery of life. The creature's flesh was pale, stretched too tightly over its bones, its limbs impossibly long and crooked. Every step it took sent shivers down David's spine. Its growl vibrated through his bones, vibrating the very walls around him. There was no escape. The doors were locked, the windows sealed shut. The asylum had become their prison, a place where time stood still, where death lingered just around every corner. David had to act. He had to end this. Now, in a moment of clarity, something that had been hidden deep within his mind surfaced. The ritual. The one the old asylum records had hinted at. The one he'd brushed aside as superstition, as myth. But now it was his only hope. Emma, no, the Wendigo, was now only a few feet away, her outstretched fingers reaching for him. He could hear her ragged breathing, the almost imperceptible sound of her joints creaking as she moved closer. There was no more room for doubt. David had to act, and he had to act fast. He turned, searching the room. His eyes fell on the old medical cabinet near the far corner. The rusted metal doors were slightly ajar, and within it, nestled among discarded syringes and old bandages, was the object he needed. A long, ancient-looking candle. It had to be. It was the key to the ritual. His hands shook as he grabbed the candle, his mind racing. The ritual, the one that could banish the Wendigo, he had to remember it correctly. He needed fire, and he needed the words of power. There was no time left. The Wendigo growled again, her form now standing directly in front of him. David's body surged with adrenaline. With a swift motion, he struck the candle against the floor, its wax breaking open, revealing a hidden wick. The match, where was it? His mind was a blur, but his hands moved with purpose. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the last match from the box. As the flame flared to life, he immediately held it to the candle's wick. The flame flickered to life, casting a dim, eerie light across the room. The Wendigo shrieked, a horrible sound that scraped against his eardrums. It was too late. The creature understood what he was doing. It knew that the ritual was his last chance. David clutched the candle with both hands, the flame casting shadows across his face as he began to chant the words he had learned from the asylum records. Spirits of the lost, hear my call. Return what was stolen. Banish the darkness. Be gone. Wretched hunger. The air in the room grew heavier. The walls seemed to bend and stretch, the temperature plummeting as though the very world was freezing around them. Emma, the Wendigo, let out another high-pitched shriek, but it was different this time. It was no longer full of rage. It was full of desperation, fear. The Wendigo had realized that it was losing its grip on this world. David felt the temperature in the room plummet further, frost creeping up the walls and the floor. His words became louder, more urgent. The Wendigo recoiled, its form jerking back in fear. The power of the ritual was taking hold. The candle's flame burned brighter, casting an unnatural glow. It flickered wildly, sending the shadows in the room dancing around like twisted specters. And then, with a deafening crack, the ground beneath David's feet shook violently. "No!" The Wendigo howled, its voice rising in pitch, its body beginning to break apart. The creature's once sharp claws began to twist, its body contorting as though it were being pulled in different directions. It was disintegrating, its grip on the world of the living weakening with every passing second. David didn't stop chanting. He couldn't. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for Emma's soul, for the souls of everyone trapped in the asylum. The Wendigo's darkness had consumed them all, but now, it was time for the light to push it back. The ground shook violently again, this time throwing David off balance. He fell, the candle rolling from his grasp and extinguishing. The room went black, but the sound of the Wendigo's screams lingered in the air. The echoes of its pain and rage filled the space, slowly fading away. When the darkness finally lifted, David blinked in disbelief. He was lying on the cold stone floor of the asylum. The room was silent, too silent. And then he heard it. Footsteps, soft at first but growing louder. He turned toward the sound, his heart in his throat. Standing in the doorway, bathed in a faint light, was Emma, alive. Her eyes were clear, her expression confused but serene. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened? Where are we?" David smiled, tears welling up in his eyes. It was over. They were free. The Wendigo was gone, banished back to the darkness it had come from. But as they embraced, a cold wind swept through the room. And in the back of David's mind, a whisper echoed, a warning he couldn't ignore. The hunger never truly dies.